When a widow fights to keep her ranch, she faces more than just brutal winters and cruel land barons. She battles a world that believes women like her don't deserve to survive. The fire came at midnight, turning 6 months of backbreaking work into ash and smoke. Abigail Thornfield, heavy-set, exhausted, and standing in the ruins of her barn, knew exactly who sent it. The same man who wanted her land, the same town that whispered she'd never make it through winter. But they underestimated one thing. A woman who's already lost everything has nothing left to fear. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The wind cut across the Montana plains like a blade, stripping warmth from anything foolish enough to stand against it. Abigail Thornfield had been standing against it for 6 months now, and she was still here. That counted for something, even if nobody in town wanted to admit it. She stood on the porch of the ranch house, a structure that had seen better decades, and watched the sun sink behind the western ridge. The sky bled orange and purple, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Thomas would have called it a painter's sky. Thomas would have stood here with his arm around her waist, pointing out the colors like they were something new, something worth stopping for. Thomas was buried on the hill behind the house now, under a stone she'd carved herself because the stonemason in town had quoted her, double the normal price. Grief tax, she'd called it. The world had a way of kicking you when you were down, then charging you for the privilege. She was a big woman, broad across the shoulders, thick through the middle, heavy in the hips, the kind of build that made men in town look away, or whisper when she passed. Too big, they'd say. Too slow. As if size determined worth, as if a woman's value could be measured by how little space she took up. Abigail had stopped caring what they thought somewhere between the funeral and the first time she'd had to shoot a coyote that got into the chicken coop. Survival had a way of burning away the parts of you that weren't essential. The ranch wasn't much. 200 acres of stubborn grass, a barn that needed repairs she couldn't afford, a dozen head of cattle that were more trouble than profit, and a house that leaked when it rained. But it was hers. Thomas had built it with his own hands, piece by piece, and she'd be damned if she'd let it go just because he wasn't here to help her hold on to it. The problem was, holding on was getting harder. She'd spent the morning mending fence line on the eastern pasture, her hands raw inside work gloves that were more whole than fabric. The wire had snapped twice, whipping back and nearly taking out her eye the second time. She'd fixed it anyway, her fingers clumsy with cold, cursing every stubborn twist of metal. Lunch had been stale bread and the last of the jerky. Dinner would be beans if she was lucky, nothing if she wasn't. The town store had stopped extending her credit 2 weeks ago. "Nothing personal, Mrs. Thornfield," the clerk had said, not meeting her eyes. "Just business." Business. As if starving was just an unfortunate side effect of good accounting. She'd sold what she could, the good horse, most of the tools, Thomas's rifle that she'd wanted to keep but couldn't justify holding on to. The money had gone to feed, to paying off the smallest debts, to keeping the wolves from the door for another few weeks. But the wolves were patient. They could wait. The wind picked up, rattling the loose board on the porch railing. She made a mental note to fix it, added it to the list of 1,000 other things that needed fixing. The list was getting longer. Her days were getting shorter. The math didn't work in her favor. A sound caught her attention. Hoofbeats, faint but distinct, coming from the south road. Visitors were rare out here. Trouble was common. She stepped off the porch, her boots crunching in the frost-hard dirt, and walked toward the gate. The sky was darkening fast now, that brief window between day and night when the world turned gray and uncertain. 2 riders emerged from the gloom, moving slow, their horses' heads down with exhaustion. A man and a child. Abigail's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt, not the big one for butchering, but the slim one she kept sharp for close work. She didn't draw it. Not yet. But her fingers rested on the handle, ready. The man pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from the gate. He was lean, worn down to bone and gristle, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His clothes were trail dirty, patched in places, threadbare in others. He sat his horse like a man who'd been riding too long, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed. The child sat in front of him, a little girl maybe 6 or 7 years old, clutching a rag doll against her chest. She had tangled brown hair and huge eyes that stared at Abigail with the kind of wariness that came from seeing too much, too young. "Help you?" Abigail's voice came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. Hard was safer. The man touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that might have been polite once, back when politeness still mattered. "Ma'am, name's Nathaniel Blackwood. This is Evie, my daughter." His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "We're looking for work. Heard in town you might need hands." Abigail's laugh was short and bitter. "You heard wrong. I can barely feed myself. Can't afford to take on help. We don't eat much." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there. Not desperation exactly, but something close to it. Pride, maybe, hanging on by its fingernails. "I can work. I know cattle, horses, repairs. I can fix most anything that's broken. Most things stay broken out here. Then I'll fix what I can." She should have said no, should have sent them on their way, pointed them toward town, wished them luck. She had enough problems without adding 2 more mouths to feed, 2 more people to worry about, 2 more souls depending on her when she could barely keep herself upright. But the child, Evie, shifted in the saddle, and the doll slipped from her fingers. It fell to the ground, landing in the dirt with a soft thump. The girl let out a small sound, not quite a cry, and the man's arm tightened around her. "It's all right," he murmured. "We'll get it." He started to dismount, but Abigail moved first. She bent down, her knees protesting, her back reminding her of every fence post she'd wrestled that day, and picked up the doll. It was a sorry thing, fabric worn smooth, 1 button eye missing, stuffing leaking from a split seam. But it had been loved. You could see it in the way the cloth had been handled, in the careful stitches someone had used to try to hold it together. She walked to the horse and held the doll up. Evie took it with both hands, her fingers small and cold. "Thank you," she whispered. Abigail looked at the child's face, thin, pale, eyes too old for someone so young. Then she looked at the man, really looked at him, saw the way his jaw was set, the way his hands gripped the reins like he was holding onto the last solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. They weren't just looking for work. They were clinging to survival. And she was tired, so tired, of being alone, of fighting every battle by herself, of waking up in the dark and wondering if today would be the day she finally broke. "Barn's in rough shape," she heard herself say, "but it's got a loft. Hay's old, but it's dry. There's a stove in the tack room that works if you don't mind the smoke." Nathaniel stared at her. "Ma'am?" "You work, you earn your keep. I can't pay wages, but you'll have a roof and food, such as it is." She met his eyes. "I don't tolerate stealing, lying, or laziness. You got a problem with that?" "No, ma'am." "And the girl goes to bed on time and doesn't wander at night. It's not safe out here in the dark." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded toward the barn. "Get your horses settled. I'll bring some supper out in an hour." She turned and walked back to the house before he could thank her, before she could change her mind, before the practical voice in her head could list all the reasons this was a mistake. Inside, the kitchen was cold. She lit the stove, added wood she couldn't spare, and started water boiling for beans. Her hands moved automatically, years of routine taking over while her mind spun in circles. What had she just done? She didn't know these people. Didn't know if the man was honest or if he'd rob her blind the first chance he got. Didn't know if bringing strangers onto her land would make her problems better or worse. But she remembered the look in the child's eyes, and she remembered being alone. The beans took forever to soften. She added salt, the last of the bacon fat, a withered onion from the root cellar. It wasn't much, but it was warm and it would fill the belly. She cut 3 thick slices of bread. The loaf was 2 days old and starting to stale, but toasted over the fire it would do. When the food was ready, she loaded it onto a tray and carried it to the barn. The door stuck, as always, and she had to hip-check it to get it open. Inside, the air smelled of hay and horse and old wood. A lantern burned in the tack room, throwing yellow light across the floor. Nathaniel had unsaddled both horses and was rubbing them down with a rag. Evie sat on a barrel in the corner, still clutching her doll. "Food," Abigail said, setting the tray on a bench. Nathaniel straightened. "That's kind of you." "It's beans. Don't get excited." But when Evie saw the bread, her eyes went wide. "Real bread?" Real enough. Abigail felt something twist in her chest. When had bread become a luxury? Eat up. It's going to be cold tonight. She turned to leave, but Nathaniel's voice stopped her. Why are you helping us? She looked back at him. His face was unreadable in the half-light, but his voice held a question that went deeper than the words. Because I know what it's like, she said quietly, being on the edge of nothing. She left before he could respond. The next morning started before dawn. Abigail woke to the sound of someone moving around outside. Footsteps, the creak of the barn door, the low murmur of a voice talking to the horses. She lay in bed for a moment, disoriented, before remembering. Nathaniel. She got up, dressed in the dark, and pulled on her coat. Outside, frost covered everything like a second skin, turning the world silver and brittle. Her breath plumed white in the air. Nathaniel was in the yard, splitting wood. The axe rose and fell with a steady rhythm, each swing clean and efficient. A pile of split logs was already growing beside the chopping block. You're up early, she said. He paused mid-swing, then brought the axe down to split the log in one stroke. Habit. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Figured you could use the firewood. I can. She'd been rationing wood, burning only enough to keep the house from freezing, letting the kitchen stove go cold most of the day. The pile he'd already split was more than she'd managed in the last week. Evie still asleep? She asked. Yes, ma'am. She doesn't sleep well in new places, but she finally went under around midnight. Abigail nodded. Let her rest. When she wakes, send her to the house. I'll make breakfast. You don't have to. I'm making it anyway. Might as well make enough. She walked back to the house, her mind already working through what she had in the pantry. Oats, a few eggs if the chickens had been productive, maybe some dried apples left from last fall. The chickens had been productive. She found 4 eggs, which felt like a small miracle. She boiled them, cooked the oats with a little honey, and sliced the last of the apples into thin wedges. It wasn't a feast, but it was better than nothing. Evie appeared at the kitchen door just as the sun was coming up, her doll tucked under one arm. She knocked, like this was someone else's house and she needed permission to enter. Come in, Abigail called. And shut the door. You're letting the heat out. The girl slipped inside and stood there, small and uncertain, her eyes darting around the kitchen. You can sit, Abigail said, pointing to the table. Evie sat, arranging her doll carefully on her lap. What's your doll's name? Lucy. Lucy's a good name. Abigail set a bowl of oatmeal in front of her, along with a boiled egg and some apple slices. Eat up. The child stared at the food like she didn't quite believe it was real. Then she picked up the spoon and started eating, slow and careful, like she'd been taught not to waste anything. Abigail poured herself coffee, weak because she was stretching the grounds as far as they'd go, and sat down across from her. How old are you, Evie? 7. Almost. You like horses? A small nod. You ever worked on a ranch before? A shake of the head. Shake of the oh. Getting words out of this child was like pulling teeth, but Abigail kept trying. What did your daddy do before this? Evie's spoon paused. Her eyes dropped to her bowl. He worked. Different places. We moved a lot. Just the 2 of you? Another nod. What happened to your mama? The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Abigail was about to take the question back when Evie finally spoke. She got sick 2 winters ago. I'm sorry. The girl shrugged, but her fingers tightened on the spoon. Papa says she's in a better place now. Abigail didn't respond to that. Better place. Maybe. Or maybe she was just gone, and the living had to find ways to keep going. That's what Abigail had done. That's what everyone did. The door opened and Nathaniel came in, bringing a gust of cold air with him. Morning. Sit, Abigail said. There's enough for you too. He hesitated, then sat beside his daughter. Abigail pushed a bowl toward him, along with an egg and his share of the apples. He ate like a man who'd gone hungry too often, fast, efficient, making sure Evie finished hers before he touched his own. After breakfast, Abigail said, I need to check the fence line on the north pasture. Wire's been snapping. If you know anything about fencing, you can come along. I know fencing. Good. Evie can stay here. There's mending that needs doing if she's handy with a needle. Evie looked up. I can sew? Then you and I will get along fine. The north fence was worse than Abigail remembered. 3 posts had rotted through at the base, and the wire sagged in places, held up more by hope than by any structural integrity. She and Nathaniel worked in silence, digging out the bad posts, sinking new ones, restringing the wire. He was good with his hands. She noticed that right away. He didn't waste motion, didn't fumble with the tools, didn't need to be told twice how she wanted things done. He just watched, learned, and worked. By midday, they'd replaced all 3 posts and tightened half the wire. Abigail's back was screaming and her hands were numb with cold, but the fence looked solid. That was something. You know your way around a ranch, she said, straightening with a wince. Worked a few over the years, Texas mostly, some in Colorado. What brought you north? His jaw tightened. Work dried up. Thought we'd find something here. And did you? You tell me. She looked at him, really looked. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe early 30s, but hard living had carved lines into his face that made him seem older. His hands were scarred, his knuckles permanently swollen from too many fights or too much hard labor. He had the look of a man who'd been knocked down more times than he could count, but kept getting back up because there was no other choice. You'll work, she said, long as you pull your weight. I will. And the girl, she going to be all right out here? Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of pain, quickly hidden. She's been through worse. She'll manage. She's quiet. She's careful. He met Abigail's eyes. The world hasn't been kind to her. She's learned not to trust easy. Smart girl. They finished the fence as the sun started its descent. Walking back to the house, Abigail felt the exhaustion settling into her bones, the kind that came from a full day's work, the kind she'd almost forgotten in the months of trying to do everything herself. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Evie had the stove going and something was cooking, actual cooking, not just beans warmed over. What's this? Abigail asked. Evie looked up from the pot she was stirring. I found potatoes in the cellar, and there was an onion. I hope that's all right. It's fine. Abigail shrugged off her coat, surprised. The girl had initiative. That was worth something. Dinner was potato soup, thin but hot and filling. They ate together at the kitchen table, 3 people who were strangers that morning, and something slightly less than strangers now. You did good work today, Abigail said to Nathaniel. So did you. She snorted. I've been doing this alone for 6 months. It's not work, it's survival. Sometimes that's the same thing. After dinner, Nathaniel and Evie went back to the barn. Abigail watched them go, the man's hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, the girl's doll tucked under her arm. Then she closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the day settle over her. She'd taken a risk, brought strangers into her life, let them see how close to the edge she really was. But for the first time in 6 months, she hadn't eaten dinner alone. That had to count for something. Plus, the days that followed fell into a rhythm. Not easy, but steady. Nathaniel worked from sunup to sundown, tackling the endless list of repairs that Abigail had been putting off. He fixed the loose boards on the porch, patched the roof where it leaked, rebuilt the chicken coop door that had been hanging crooked for months. Evie found her own place in the household. She helped with the cooking, tended the chickens, mended clothes that had been torn for so long Abigail had forgotten they could be fixed. The girl had careful hands and a quiet competence that reminded Abigail of herself at that age, learning to be useful because useful meant valued. Abigail worked alongside Nathaniel, matching him hour for hour. She was strong, stronger than people gave her credit for, and she'd learned not to slow down just because her body complained. Pain was just noise. You could ignore noise if you had to. They spoke little while they worked. Nathaniel wasn't much for conversation, and Abigail had spent 6 months talking to herself or the animals. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just there, a space they both needed. But sometimes in the evenings, after Evie had gone to bed, Nathaniel would linger in the kitchen while Abigail washed the supper dishes. He'd dry them without being asked, his movements slow and methodical. And occasionally he'd say something, a comment about the day's work, a question about the ranch. A memory from his own past offered up carefully, like he wasn't sure if she wanted to hear it. I grew up on a ranch, he said one night. Smaller than this, down in Texas Hill Country. What happened to it? My father lost it. Cards, mostly. Some bad cattle deals. He drank himself to death a year later. Abigail nodded, not looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. My husband built this place from nothing. Took him 15 years. He was proud of every acre. What happened to him? Horse spooked, threw him into a fence post, broke his neck. She scrubbed harder. Quick, at least. He didn't suffer. I'm sorry. Me too. They finished the dishes in silence. 3 weeks after Nathaniel and Evie arrived, Abigail went into town for supplies. She didn't want to go. Going to town meant facing the whispers, the looks, the cold shoulder from people who'd known her for years but treated her like a stranger now that Thomas was gone. But they needed flour, salt, coffee, things she couldn't make or grow. She hitched up the wagon, and Evie surprised her by climbing up onto the seat beside her. "Thought you might like company," the girl said quietly. Abigail considered sending her back, then changed her mind. "All right, but stay close in town. Don't wander." The ride took an hour, the wagon jolting over ruts and stones. Evie sat with Lucy clutched in her lap, her eyes taking in everything. The rolling hills, the scattered pines, the way the mountains rose up in the distance like jagged teeth. "It's big out here," she said. "It is." "Do you ever get lonely?" Abigail glanced at her. The girl was staring straight ahead, her face carefully neutral. "Sometimes," Abigail admitted, "but lonely's better than some alternatives." Town was a collection of weathered buildings, huddled along a single main street, general store, saloon, church, blacksmith, and a handful of houses where the merchants and their families lived. It wasn't much, but it was the only civilization for 50 miles. Abigail parked the wagon in front of the store and climbed down. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and pickles and the dusty scent of dry goods. The clerk, a thin man named Silas with a mustache that drooped past his chin, looked up when she entered, and his expression went carefully blank. "Mrs. Thornfield?" "Silas?" She set her list on the counter. "Need these if you can spare them." He picked up the list, read it, and shook his head. "Can't do credit, ma'am. I told you that last time." "I'm not asking for credit. I've got money." She pulled out the coins she'd been saving. Not much, but enough for what she needed. Silas looked at them, then at her, and she could see him calculating. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll get your order together." While he worked, Abigail became aware of voices from the back of the store. Men's voices, low and amused. "That's her, ain't it? Thornfield's widow." "Yeah, big woman. Heard she's trying to run that ranch all by herself." "Won't last. Winter'll break her if the land don't." "Should have sold when she had the chance. Hartwell offered her fair price." "Fair for him, maybe." Laughter, rough and unkind. Abigail's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on the counter. She'd heard worse. She'd hear it again. Let them talk. Silas finished packing her supplies and loaded them into a crate. "That'll be $3 even." She counted out the coins, and he swept them off the counter without meeting her eyes. "Pleasure doing business," he muttered. She picked up the crate, heavy, but she'd carried heavier, and turned to leave, and nearly walked into a man standing directly behind her. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that marked him as someone with money, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. He looked her up and down, slow and deliberate, and smiled. "Mrs. Thornfield." "I don't know you." "Pike Morrison. I work for Mr. Cyrus Hartwell." The name hit her like a fist to the gut. Hartwell, the man who'd been trying to buy her land since before Thomas died. The man who'd sent men to check on her 6 times in the last 6 months, each visit a thinly veiled threat. "I have nothing to say to you or your boss." "Now that's a shame." Morrison's smile didn't waver. "Because Mr. Hartwell has plenty to say to you. He's a patient man, Mrs. Thornfield, but even patience has limits. That ranch of yours is sitting on good grazing land, land that could be put to better use." "It's being used just fine." "Is it?" He glanced past her at Evie, who stood frozen by the door. "Seems to me a woman in your position, alone, struggling, might want to reconsider her options. Sell now, while the offer's still on the table, before circumstances get Difficult. I said no. You sure about that? His voice dropped, friendly as a snake. Winter's coming. Things can happen out there in the cold. Animals get lost, buildings catch fire, people get hurt. He leaned in closer. Would be a shame if something happened to you, or to that child. Abigail's vision narrowed. Her hand tightened on the crate, knuckles white. You threatening me? Just offering friendly advice. She stepped forward, and Morrison stepped back. Just a half step. But enough. She might be a woman, might be bigger than most men thought proper, but she was still big. And right now, she was angry. You tell Hartwell he can take his offer and choke on it. That land is mine. It's staying mine. And if he sends anyone else to threaten me, I'll put a bullet in them. Morrison's smile finally cracked. Careful, ma'am. Threats like that can come back on you. It's not a threat. It's a promise. She pushed past him and walked out of the store, Evie hurrying after her. They loaded the supplies into the wagon in silence, and Abigail climbed up onto the seat, her hand shaking with rage. Miss Abigail? Evie's voice was small. Who was that man? Nobody who matters. But as they rode out of town, Abigail kept glancing back over her shoulder, half expecting to see riders following them. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, and her anger had settled into something colder and harder. She unloaded the wagon with Nathaniel's help, carrying the supplies into the house while Evie put the horses away. Trouble in town? Nathaniel asked, reading her face. When isn't there? She told him about Morrison, about Hartwell's offer, about the threat. Nathaniel's expression darkened. Hartwell's the man who owns half the valley, isn't he? That's the one. And he wants your land. He wants everyone's land. He's been buying up ranches for years, squeezing out anyone who won't sell. Thomas fought him for a decade. What happens if you don't sell? Abigail set down the last of the supplies and turned to face him. Then he makes life difficult until I do. That's how it works. You going to let him? She met his eyes. No. Then we'd better be ready. We? He nodded. You gave me and Evie a place when we had nothing. I'm not walking away from that. Not now. Something in Abigail's chest loosened, just a fraction. She wasn't alone. Not completely. All right, she said. Then we get ready. The next 2 weeks were spent preparing. Nathaniel reinforced the barn doors, fixed the locks, moved the most valuable tools into the house where they could be secured. Abigail inventoried their ammunition, not much, but enough to make a stand if it came to that. She taught Evie how to load the rifle, how to bar the doors from inside, what to do if strangers came while the adults were out in the fields. It felt like preparing for war. Maybe it was. And then, one night, the fire came. Abigail woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. She was out of bed and into her boots before her mind fully caught up, grabbing the rifle from beside the door and running out into the yard. The barn was burning. Flames roared from the hayloft, orange and hungry, devouring the dry wood like it was paper. Smoke poured into the sky, turning the night red and hellish. Nathaniel, she screamed. Evie! The barn door burst open and Nathaniel stumbled out, coughing, his arms full of saddles and tack. Evie's in the house. The horses... I'll get them! She ran toward the barn, heat hitting her like a wall. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the horses wild with panic. The two in the stalls nearest the door, her old mare and Nathaniel's gelding, she got out first, dragging them by their halters and slapping their rumps to send them running into the yard. The other two were deeper in, trapped behind a wall of fire. The heat was unbearable, searing her lungs with every breath, but she pushed forward, her eyes streaming, her hands fumbling with the stall latches. The third horse bolted past her the moment the door swung open. The fourth, a young mare, wild-eyed and kicking, wouldn't move. Abigail grabbed a rope, looped it around the mare's neck, and pulled. Come on, damn you! Move! The mare reared, and for a second Abigail thought she was going to go down under those hooves. But she held on, and when the mare landed, she was already running, dragging the animal with her through the fire and smoke and out into the blessed cold air of the yard. She let go of the rope and fell to her knees, coughing so hard she thought she'd break ribs. Nathaniel was beside her, his hands on her shoulders. You all right? She couldn't answer, just nodded, still coughing. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames climbing toward the sky. There was nothing left to save. They stood there and watched it burn. 3 people and 4 horses, the heat baking the tears on Abigail's face until she didn't know if she was crying or just sweating. By the time the fire burned itself out, it was dawn. The barn was nothing but charred timbers and ash, still smoking, still radiating heat. 6 months of work, gone. Evie stood on the porch, clutching Lucy, her face pale and streaked with soot. Nathaniel walked the perimeter of the ruin, his expression unreadable. Abigail stood in the middle of it all, exhausted and filthy and angrier than she'd ever been in her life. This wasn't an accident. She knew that. They all knew that. This was war. And if Hartwell wanted a war, she'd give him one. The sheriff showed up 3 days later, riding slow like he had all the time in the world. Abigail was in the yard with Nathaniel, sifting through what was left of the barn. Bent nails, charred tools, anything that might still be useful. Her hands were blistered from digging through hot ash, and every breath she took still tasted like smoke. Sheriff Tom Garrett was a heavy man with a badge that looked like it weighed more than his conscience. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, elected mostly because nobody else wanted the job. He sat his horse and looked at the wreckage for a long minute before speaking. "Heard you had a fire." Abigail straightened, wiping soot from her forehead with the back of her hand. "You heard right. That's a real shame. Barn fires are dangerous things." This wasn't an accident. Garrett shifted in his saddle. "Now, Mrs. Thornfield, I understand you're upset, but making accusations without proof, I have proof. Pike Morrison threatened me in town not 3 weeks ago. Said things could happen. Buildings could catch fire. Those were his exact words. Morrison works for Mr. Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell's a respected businessman in this valley. Mr. Hartwell's a thief who burns down barns when people won't sell to him." The sheriff's mouth tightened. "That's a serious charge. Then do something about it. I'd need evidence, witnesses, something more than your word against Morrison's." Abigail took a step forward, and Garrett's horse sidestepped nervously. "My barn is evidence. My livelihood is sitting in ashes. What more do you need?" Could have been a spark from your stove, could have been lightning, could have been 1,000 things. He gathered his reins. "I'll look into it, but unless you've got witnesses who actually saw someone set that fire, there's not much I can do." "Of course there isn't." Garrett tipped his hat, his face carefully neutral. "You take care now, Mrs. Thornfield, and maybe think about accepting Hartwell's offer. Man's been more than generous, from what I hear." He rode away before she could respond, and Abigail stood there watching him go, rage burning in her chest hotter than any fire. "He's in Hartwell's pocket," Nathaniel said quietly behind her. "They all are." She turned back to the ruins. "We're on our own." That night, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with pencil and paper, doing math she already knew wouldn't work. The barn had held feed, tools, shelter for the horses. Replacing it would cost money she didn't have. Winter was 6 weeks away, maybe less. Without a barn, the animals would freeze. Without the animals, she'd have no way to work the land come spring. She set down the pencil and pressed her palms against her eyes, hard enough to see stars. "You should sleep." She looked up. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the lamplight from the hall. "Can't afford to sleep. Gotta figure this out." "You won't figure it out tonight." "Then when?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "When winter comes and the cattle freeze? When Hartwell rides in and takes this place because I can't hold it anymore? When?" He stepped into the room, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. For a moment he just looked at the numbers she'd scratched out, the desperate calculations that didn't add up no matter how many times she ran them. "We rebuild," he said. "With what? I've got maybe $40 to my name. A new barn would cost 10 times that." "Then we don't build new. We build enough." He tapped the paper. "Enough to get through winter. We use what's left of the old timber, scavenge materials from the collapsed section, make do with what we have. Won't be pretty, but it'll stand." "You know how to do that?" "I know how to make things work when there's no other choice. Learned that early." Abigail studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the scar on his chin, the way his jaw set when he was thinking hard about something. He wasn't offering miracles. He was offering stubbornness. She could work with that. "All right," she said. "We try." They started the next morning. Nathaniel walked the burned-out shell of the barn, testing timbers, pulling aside debris, marking what could be salvaged and what was too far gone. Abigail helped him drag out the good wood, charred on the outside but solid at the core. They stacked it in piles, sorted by size, while Evie collected nails from the ash, wiping them clean and dropping them into a bucket. It was slow work, backbreaking. Every piece of lumber felt like it weighed twice what it should, and by noon Abigail's shoulders were screaming. But they kept at it. They didn't have a choice. By the third day, they had enough material to start building. Nathaniel laid out the frame, smaller than the original barn, just big enough for the horses and essential supplies. They worked side by side, driving posts into the hard ground, fitting beams together, using salvaged nails and whatever scraps of rope and wire they could find. Abigail's body remembered this kind of labor. She'd helped Thomas build the original barn 15 years ago, back when her hands were softer and her back didn't ache with every movement. She'd carried lumber then, too, mixed mortar, held beams in place while he hammered. People in town had whispered even then. A woman doing man's work, they'd said, like it was shameful. Like strength was something women weren't allowed to have. She'd stopped caring what they thought a long time ago. "Hold this steady," Nathaniel said, bracing a crossbeam. She grabbed the other end, muscles bunching as she took the weight. He climbed up on a ladder and started hammering, and she held that beam in place until her arms trembled and her vision went spotty at the edges. But she held it. When he finished and climbed down, she lowered the beam carefully and sat down hard in the dirt, breathing like she'd run a mile. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine. You push yourself too hard." "And you don't?" He almost smiled. Almost. Fair point. They worked until dark, then stumbled inside where Evie had somehow put together a supper of fried potatoes and the last of the salt pork. They ate in silence, too tired to talk. Then Nathaniel and Evie went to the tack room, the only part of the old barn still standing, while Abigail collapsed into bed without bothering to undress. The pattern repeated for 2 weeks. Rise before dawn, work until exhaustion, sleep like the dead, wake up and do it again. The frame went up. The walls took shape. The roof, cobbled together from salvaged tin and boards that didn't quite match, finally closed over the top. It wasn't pretty. The walls were uneven, the roof leaked in 2 places, and the whole structure leaned slightly to the left. But it was standing, and when they moved the horses in out of the weather, the animals settled like they knew they were safe. Abigail stood in the doorway of the new barn, looking at what they'd built from scraps and stubbornness, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. "It'll do," Nathaniel said beside her. "It'll have to." That night, for the first time since the fire, she slept without nightmares. But the peace didn't last. A week later, Abigail rode into town for supplies, just flour and coffee, the bare minimum. She left Nathaniel and Evie at the ranch with strict instructions to stay close to the house and keep the rifle loaded. The general store was quiet when she walked in, just Silas behind the counter and an old woman Abigail didn't recognize picking through bolts of fabric. Silas looked up when the bell jangled and his expression went carefully blank. "Mrs. Thornfield." "Silas?" She set her list on the counter. "Just these today." He picked up the list, read it, and shook his head. "Can't do it." "Can't or won't." Same difference. He pushed the list back toward her. "Mr. Hartwell came by yesterday, said I wasn't to extend you any more goods, cash or nothing." She pulled out her money, the last of it, coins she'd been hoarding for emergencies. "This is cash." Silas looked at the coins, then at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe. Or just exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Hartwell owns the bank that holds my loan. If I cross him, I lose the store. I got a family to feed." "So do I." "I know." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "But I can't help you." Abigail gathered up her coins, her hands steady even though her insides were shaking with rage. "You're a coward, Silas." "Maybe. But I'm a coward who still has a roof over his head." She walked out without another word. Outside, the street was empty except for a single rider leaning against a hitching post. Pike Morrison. He straightened when he saw her, that same cold smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Thornfield, lovely day, isn't it?" She walked past him toward her wagon. "Heard you had some trouble getting supplies," he called after her. "That's unfortunate, but these things happen when people make poor decisions." She stopped, her hand on the wagon rail, and turned to face him. "You burned my barn." "Now, that's a serious accusation. You got proof?" "I don't need proof. I know it was you." Morrison pushed off the hitching post and walked toward her, casual as a Sunday stroll. "You know what your problem is, Mrs. Thornfield? You don't know when to quit. You're sitting on land you can't work, trying to run a ranch you can't afford, and you're too stubborn to admit defeat." He stopped a few feet away, looking her up and down. "A woman like you, alone, struggling. It's not natural. You should be in town doing woman's work, sewing, cooking, something appropriate." Appropriate. The word tasted like poison. "That's right, this ranch life. It's too hard for someone in your position, too dangerous." His smile widened. "Things could get worse, you know, a lot worse. Accidents happen out there. Animals disappear. People get hurt." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice. "Or maybe something happens to that hired man of yours, or his little girl. Would be a real shame." Abigail's vision narrowed. Her hand moved to the knife at her belt, the big one, the one she used for butchering. Morrison saw the movement and stepped back, his hand going to his own gun. "Careful now. You threaten my people again," she said, her voice low and deadly calm, "and I'll cut you open from throat to belly and let the crows have what's left." For a moment, just a moment, she saw real fear flash across his face. Then he laughed, forced and too loud. "Big talk for a woman who can't even buy flour." He turned and walked away, but she noticed he kept his hand on his gun until he was well out of knife range. Abigail climbed into the wagon and drove out of town with her head high and her hand shaking on the reins. She made it 2 miles before she had to pull over and vomit into the ditch, her body finally catching up with the rage and fear churning in her gut. When she got back to the ranch, Nathaniel took one look at her face and knew. What happened? She told him. All of it. The store refusing her business, Morrison's threats, the way the whole town had turned its back on her because Hartwell owned them all, owned their jobs, their loans, their futures. "He's trying to starve us out," she finished. "Can't buy supplies in town, can't afford to travel to the next settlement. He's cutting us off. How much food do we have? Enough for maybe 3 weeks if we're careful. After that," she shook her head, "we'll have to start slaughtering cattle, and that's our seed stock for next year. If we kill them now, we've got nothing left to build on." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then, "There's another option." "What?" "We hunt, fish, live off the land until winter breaks. I've done it before." "For how long?" "Long enough to survive." It wasn't a good plan, it was barely a plan at all, but it was all they had. The next morning, Nathaniel took the rifle and disappeared into the hills. He came back at dusk with 2 rabbits and a grouse. Not much, but it was meat. Abigail cleaned them while Evie boiled potatoes, and they ate a dinner that was small but filling enough to quiet the gnawing in their bellies. It became routine. Every morning, Nathaniel would head out to hunt while Abigail worked the ranch, mending fences, checking the cattle, doing all the endless tasks that ranching demanded. Evie helped where she could, feeding the chickens, tending the small vegetable garden that was barely hanging on as the weather turned cold. Some days Nathaniel came back empty-handed. Some days he brought rabbit or squirrel or once a young deer that kept them fed for nearly a week. They rationed everything: meat, flour, coffee. Evie learned to make bread with half the usual flour, stretching it with water until the loaves were dense and tasteless but still filled the stomach. Abigail's clothes started hanging loose. She'd been heavy all her life, and now she watched the weight fall off in a way that might have pleased her once, but now just felt like defeat. Her body was eating itself to stay alive. Nathaniel lost weight too, his face getting sharper, his movements more economical as his body learned to conserve energy. Only Evie seemed unchanged. Abigail made sure the girl ate first, ate most, ate enough to keep growing. "You need to eat more," Nathaniel said one night, watching Abigail push half her portion toward Evie. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're running yourself into the ground. So are you." They stared at each other across the table, two stubborn people too tired to argue properly. "We can't keep this up," he said quietly. "Not through a full winter. We'll manage. Abigail? We'll manage." She stood up, gathering the plates. "We don't have another choice." But she knew he was right. They were holding on by their fingernails, and winter was coming. Real winter, the kind that killed cattle and froze pipes and buried the world in snow for months. The kind they weren't prepared for. 2 weeks before the first snow, a rider came to the ranch. Not Morrison this time. Someone new. A young man, barely 20, wearing a clean suit and riding a good horse. He stopped at the gate and called out, "Mrs. Thornfield, I have a message from Mr. Cyrus Hartwell." Abigail walked out to meet him, Nathaniel a few steps behind her with the rifle cradled in his arms. Not pointed, not yet, but ready. The young man looked nervous. "Mr. Hartwell asked me to deliver this personally." He held out an envelope. Abigail took it, tore it open, and read the letter inside. The words were polite, formal, an offer to purchase her land for half what it was worth, with the generous addition of enough money to resettle comfortably elsewhere. She read it twice, then looked up at the messenger. "You tell Hartwell he can take his offer and shove it up his—" "Ma'am!" The young man's face went red. Mr. Hartwell was very clear. This is his final offer. If you refuse, he can't be responsible for what happens next.
"Oh, what happens next? You mean more fires, more threats? I don't know anything about that, ma'am. I'm just delivering a message." Abigail tore the letter in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall to the ground. "There's my answer. Now get off my land." The messenger turned his horse and rode away fast, and Abigail stood there watching him go, feeling the weight of what she'd just done settle over her like a stone. "You think that was smart?" Nathaniel asked. "Smart doesn't matter anymore." "What does?" She turned to look at him, this man who'd shown up at her gate 2 months ago with nothing but a horse and a daughter and desperation in his eyes, who'd stayed when anyone with sense would have run, who stood beside her now with a rifle in his hands and the same stubborn set to his jaw that she felt in her own bones. "Surviving," she said. "That's all that matters now." That night, Abigail lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the house and thought about the letter, about Hartwell's final offer, about what happened to people who refused men like him. Thomas had refused him for 10 years, and Thomas was dead. Maybe it had been an accident. Maybe the horse really had just spooked, but lying there in the dark, listening to the wind that sounded like voices whispering threats, she wasn't so sure anymore. She thought about selling. Just for a moment, she let herself imagine it. Taking Hartwell's money, leaving this place, starting over somewhere else, somewhere easier, somewhere she wouldn't have to fight for every scrap of ground. But this land held Thomas's bones, held his sweat and blood and 15 years of dreams. Selling it would mean admitting he'd died for nothing. She couldn't do that, wouldn't. The first snow came 3 days later, just a dusting, but enough to coat the ground white and make the cattle huddle together for warmth. Abigail stood in the yard and watched the flakes fall, each one a small promise of harder times ahead. Evie came out onto the porch wrapped in a shawl, her breath misting in the cold air. "Miss Abigail, is it going to be all right?" Abigail wanted to say yes, wanted to promise this child that everything would work out, that they'd make it through, that spring would come and the world would be kind again. But she'd learned not to make promises she couldn't keep. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we're going to try." The girl nodded, accepting this. Children who'd lived hard lives learned early that try was sometimes the best you could hope for. That afternoon, Nathaniel came back from hunting empty-handed and covered in snow. His lips were blue with cold, and his hand shook so badly he could barely hold the rifle. Abigail got him inside, sat him by the stove, made him drink hot water with a precious spoonful of honey dissolved in it. Gradually, the shaking stopped and color came back to his face. "Nothing out there," he said when he could speak again. "Everything's gone to ground for winter." "Then we make do with what we have." They inventoried the supplies that night. Flour enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if they stretched it thin. A little coffee, some dried beans, 6 jars of preserves. The rabbits Nathaniel had smoked were hanging in the cellar, along with what was left of the deer. It wasn't enough.
not nearly enough. We could slaughter a steer, Nathaniel suggested. That's our breeding stock. We kill one, we're stealing from next year. If we don't make it through this winter, there won't be a next year. He was right. She hated that he was right. One, she said finally. The old bull. He's past breeding age anyway. But we use every part. Nothing gets wasted. They slaughtered the bull the next morning, and it was ugly work. The animal was old and tough, and it took 2 shots to bring him down. Abigail cut his throat while Nathaniel held the head, and they both got soaked in blood that steamed in the cold air. Butchering took all day. They worked with knives that needed sharpening, their hands going numb, flies swarming despite the cold. By evening, they had meat hanging in the cellar, bones boiling for broth, hide stretched for tanning. Evie had helped with the organs, her small hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned intestines for sausage casing. That night they ate fresh beef for the first time in weeks, and it tasted like victory. But the victory was temporary. The snow kept coming, light at first, but building. By the end of the week, there was 3 inches on the ground, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their winter coats. The chickens stopped laying. The world turned white and hostile. And then Morrison came back. Abigail was in the barn feeding the horses when she heard the hoofbeats. She grabbed the rifle. She kept it close these days, always loaded, and stepped out into the yard. 4 riders. Morrison in front, 3 men she didn't recognize backing him up. They sat their horses in a line, and something about the formation made her stomach drop. "Mrs. Thornfield!" Morrison touched his hat brim, mocking polite. "Cold day for it. State your business or get off my land. Direct. I like that about you." He gestured to the men with him. "These gentlemen are here to help you with your cattle. I don't need help." "See, that's where you're wrong. Mr. Hartwell noticed some of your cattle have been wandering onto his land, eating his grass, drinking from his streams. That's theft, technically." "My cattle are on my land." "Are they?" Funny thing about property lines in winter. They get unclear, especially when fences go down. He smiled. "We're here to collect what's owed. Call it a fine for trespassing." "You're not taking my cattle." "I don't think you're in a position to stop us." Abigail raised the rifle, settling it against her shoulder. The movement was smooth, practiced. She saw Morrison's eyes widen slightly. "I've got 6 rounds in this rifle," she said calmly. "There's 4 of you. The math works in my favor." "You'd shoot us? For cattle?" "For my land, my livelihood, my life." She sighted down the barrel at Morrison's chest. "Try me." For a long moment nobody moved. The wind blew snow across the yard, and somewhere a horse stamped nervously. Abigail kept the rifle steady, her finger resting on the trigger, her heart hammering but her hands rock solid. Then Nathaniel stepped out of the barn with his own rifle, and Evie appeared on the porch with Thomas's old shotgun. Too big for her, but she held it like she knew which end was which. Morrison looked at the 3 of them, did the math, and came up short. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Abigail agreed. "It's not." He turned his horse and rode away, his men following. Abigail kept the rifle up until they were out of sight, then lowered it slowly, her arms trembling with more than just the weight. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "That was close. Too close." "He'll be back?" "With more men." "I know." "So what do we do?" Abigail looked at her ranch, the patched-together barn, the thin cattle, the house where smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. Everything she'd fought for, everything she stood to lose. "We hold," she said, "and we hope winter breaks him before he breaks us." But winter didn't break Hartwell. It broke them. The cold came down hard the week after Morrison's visit, temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the bucket before Abigail could carry it from the well to the house. The cattle huddled in the lee of the makeshift barn, their breath-forming clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. 2 of the older cows died in their sleep, frozen where they stood, and Abigail had to use an axe to break them free from the ice before she could drag them away from the others. Food ran low, then lower. The beef from the slaughtered bull lasted 3 weeks, rationed down to portions so small they barely qualified as meals. The flour gave out. The coffee became a memory. They ate boiled bones for the marrow, chewed on leather scraps softened in hot water, made soup from snow and whatever scraps of vegetable they could scavenge from the frozen garden. Abigail felt her body changing in ways that frightened her. Her clothes hung loose, her belt cinched tight enough to leave marks. Her hands looked strange to her own eyes. Bones too prominent, skin stretched thin. When she caught her reflection in the window glass, she saw a woman she barely recognized, all sharp angles and hollow spaces where softness used to be. Evie grew quiet, more than usual. The girl moved through the house like a shadow, her eyes too big in her thin face. Lucy clutched perpetually against her chest. She didn't complain, never asked for more food, just ate what she was given and said thank you in a voice that got smaller every day. Nathaniel pushed himself harder, disappearing into the frozen hills every morning with the rifle, coming back hours later with nothing to show but frostbitten fingers and defeat in his eyes. The game had vanished, driven deep into winter dens or migrated to warmer country. The land had become a white desert, beautiful and merciless. "We need help," he said one night, his voice rough from cold and exhaustion. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the three of them, with bowls of hot water in front of them because there was nothing else to put in the bowls. Abigail had added salt to make it seem more like soup. It didn't work. "There is no help," Abigail said. "There's the neighbors. The Johnsons have that spread 15 miles east, the Carmichaels to the north. They're ranchers, too. They'd understand. They're Hartwell's people now. Everyone is. You don't know that. I know how this works. Hartwell owns the bank, owns the store, owns the sheriff. He's got his hooks in everyone. We ask for help, word gets back to him, and he uses it against us." She wrapped her hands around her bowl, trying to steal warmth from water that was already going cold. "We're on our own. Then we're going to die on our own." Evie's head came up at that, her eyes wide and frightened. Nathaniel saw it and cursed under his breath. "Sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Abigail's voice was flat. "And you're probably right, but I'm not selling. I'm not giving Hartwell the satisfaction. This isn't about satisfaction anymore. This is about survival. It's always been about survival." They stared at each other across the table, two people too tired and hungry to fight properly, but too stubborn to back down. Finally, Nathaniel looked away. "We're running out of time," he said quietly. "I know." That night, lying in bed listening to the wind scream around the house, Abigail allowed herself to think about dying. Really think about it. What it would feel like to just stop. To let go. To close her eyes and not have to wake up to another day of cold and hunger and impossible choices. It would be easy. Easier than this. But then she thought about Thomas, buried on the hill, about the ranch he'd built from nothing, about Evie's thin face and quiet acceptance of suffering she was too young to understand. Easy wasn't the point. It had never been the point. She got out of bed, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and went to the window. Outside, the world was silver with moonlight on snow, so bright it hurt to look at. Beautiful, deadly. A landscape that didn't care if she lived or died. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made herself a promise. She would survive this. Not because she deserved to, not because it was fair or right or just, but because Hartwell expected her to fail, and she'd be damned if she'd give him what he wanted. The next morning brought a surprise. Abigail was in the barn checking on the horses when she heard the sound of wagon wheels crunching through snow. She grabbed the rifle and stepped outside, expecting Morrison or worse. Instead, she found Margaret Johnson sitting on the seat of a loaded wagon, her face red with cold, her gray hair escaping from under a wool cap. Margaret was a widow like Abigail, though her husband had died of fever rather than accident. She ran her own spread with the help of 2 sons, and she'd never been the type to ask permission or apologize for taking up space. Abigail had always respected that about her, even if they'd never been close. "Margaret? Don't just stand there gawking. Help me unload this." Abigail set the rifle aside and moved to the wagon. The bed was full, sacks of flour and beans, a side of bacon, dried apples, even a small bag of coffee. Enough food to last weeks. "I can't pay you for this," Abigail said. "Did I ask for payment?" Margaret climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of someone whose joints had spent too many winters fighting the cold. I heard you were having trouble. Figured you could use some help.
How did you hear? Word gets around. Morrison's been bragging in town about how he's going to starve you out. I don't much care for Morrison. She started hauling sacks off the wagon. Or for men who make war on women. Abigail grabbed a sack of flour, the weight of it almost making her knees buckle. When had she gotten this week? Hartwell's going to hear about this. Let him hear. My boys and I paid off our loans 2 years ago. Hartwell's got no leverage on us. Margaret dropped a sack of beans in the snow and fixed Abigail with a sharp look. Besides, I remember when your Thomas helped us rebuild after the flood of '68. Didn't ask for payment then, didn't ask for thanks. Just showed up and worked. Figure it's time I returned the favor. They carried the supplies into the house in silence, and when the wagon was empty, Margaret refused to come inside for coffee. Gotta get back before the snow starts again. Storm's coming tonight. You can smell it. She climbed back onto the wagon seat. You need anything else? You send word? And Abigail? Yeah? Don't you dare sell to that bastard. Some of us are tired of watching him swallow up everything in this valley. She drove away before Abigail could respond, the wagon tracks cutting dark lines through the white landscape. Nathaniel came around the corner of the barn just as the wagon disappeared over the rise. Who was that? A neighbor. Abigail looked at the supplies stacked in the kitchen, more food than they'd seen in months. Turns out we're not as alone as I thought. That night they ate bread with real butter, beans seasoned with bacon, dried apples stewed with a little sugar Margaret had tucked into the supplies. Evie ate until her stomach hurt, and Abigail had to stop herself from doing the same. After weeks of near starvation, too much food too fast would make them sick. But having food, real food, enough food, changed something. The house felt warmer. The darkness outside seemed less oppressive. For the first time in weeks, Abigail went to sleep without the hollow ache of hunger keeping her awake. The storm Margaret had predicted rolled in before dawn. Abigail woke to the sound of wind howling like something alive and angry, snow driving against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. She got up and added wood to the stove, precious wood that they could afford to burn now that they weren't slowly freezing and starving at the same time. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of whiteout conditions, of snow piling up against the doors, of the whole world reduced to the walls of the house and the sound of wind trying to tear them down. They stayed inside, venturing out only to check on the animals, moving from house to barn along a rope Nathaniel had strung between the two buildings because visibility was measured in inches. On the 4th day, the wind died. Abigail opened the door to a world transformed. Snow drifted higher than her waist in places. The landscape sculpted into shapes that looked alien and strange. The barn was almost completely buried, just the peak of the roof visible above the white. We need to dig out, Nathaniel said, already pulling on his coat. They spent the day shoveling, carving paths from house to barn to well, clearing snow from the roof before the weight collapsed the whole structure. It was brutal work, and Abigail's back screamed with every shovelful, but they kept at it. They had food now. They had strength. They could do this. Evie helped where she could, her small shovel moving half the snow of the adult ones, but working twice as fast to make up for it. The girl's cheeks went pink with exertion, and Abigail caught her smiling at one point, actually smiling, as she threw a shovelful of snow that exploded in a white cloud. For a moment, things felt almost normal, like they were a family doing chores together, rather than 3 desperate people clinging to survival by their fingernails. The moment didn't last. They were finishing up, the sun already setting, when Nathaniel stopped mid-shovel and went still. What? Abigail asked. He pointed south toward the road. Riders. Abigail's stomach dropped. She counted 5 shapes moving through the snow, dark against white, coming fast. Even at this distance, she recognized Morrison's horse. Get inside, she told Evie. Now. But now! The girl ran for the house. Lucy clutched against her chest. Abigail and Nathaniel moved to meet the riders at the gate, both of them armed, both of them knowing this wasn't going to end well. Morrison pulled up at the fence line, 4 men flanking him. Different men than last time, harder looking with the kind of faces that said they got paid to hurt people and didn't lose sleep over it. Mrs. Thornfield, Mr. Blackwood. Morrison's breath plumed white in the cold air. Nice work on the digging. Be a shame if it was for nothing.
State your business. My business is simple. Mr. Hartwell's patience has run out. This is your last chance to accept his offer. Morrison pulled out a folded paper. Sign this deed of sale, take the money, and walk away. Or we take the land anyway and you get nothing. I'm not selling. Then you're trespassing. This land belongs to Mr. Hartwell as of noon today. He filed a claim with the Territory Land Office, citing abandonment and unpaid taxes. Abigail's blood went cold. I paid my taxes. Did you? Funny thing, the county office has no record of payment. That's a lie. I paid Sheriff Garrett directly in September. Morrison shrugged. Your word against the county records, and I think we know which one the judge will believe. This is theft. This is business. He gestured to the men with him. Now, you can leave peacefully, or my associates here can help you leave. Your choice. Nathaniel raised his rifle. Or you can try to take this land and see how many of you die trying. One of Morrison's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, drew his pistol. That's a threat. That's a promise. For a moment, everyone was frozen, guns pointed, fingers on triggers, the whole scene balanced on the edge of violence. Then Morrison laughed. You'd really die for this? For some frozen dirt in a half-collapsed barn? People have died for less, Abigail said. Morrison studied her face, and something shifted in his expression. You know what? I believe you would. You're crazy enough. He gathered his reins. But here's the thing about dying for your principles, Mrs. Thornfield. You end up just as dead. He turned his horse, and for a moment Abigail thought he was leaving. Then he nodded to his men, and everything happened at once. Two of them spurred their horses forward, not toward Abigail and Nathaniel, but toward the barn. The third pulled something from his saddlebag, a bottle with a rag stuffed in the neck. A torch. No! Abigail screamed, but the man had already lit the rag and thrown the bottle in a high arc. It shattered against the barn wall, and flames exploded across the dry wood. Nathaniel fired, the shot echoing across the snow. One of the riders went down, his horse screaming. The other two wheeled around, drawing their guns, and suddenly bullets were flying. Abigail dove for cover behind a fence post, her rifle bucking against her shoulder as she returned fire. Wood splintered next to her head. She heard Nathaniel cursing, heard more shots, heard the roar of flames as the barn caught. The horses. She broke cover and ran, bullets kicking up snow around her feet. Behind her, Nathaniel was shouting something, but she couldn't hear it over the pounding of her heart and the crackle of fire. The barn was already engulfed, flames eating through the walls they'd worked so hard to rebuild. Heat blasted her face as she reached the door and yanked it open. Smoke poured out, thick and black, and she plunged into it blind. The horses were going crazy, screaming their terror, hooves hammering against stall walls. She couldn't see anything, could barely breathe, but she felt her way forward by memory. Her hands found the first stall door, yanked it open. The mare inside bolted past her, nearly knocking her down. Second stall. Third. The heat was unbearable now, her lungs burning with every breath. Fourth stall. She got the door open, but the horse inside wouldn't move, wild-eyed and frozen with fear. She grabbed a rope, looped it around the animal's neck, and pulled. Come on, you stubborn bastard! Move! The horse reared, and its hoof caught her shoulder, sending her sprawling. Pain exploded through her arm, white-hot and blinding. But she kept hold of the rope, and when the horse came down, it was already moving, dragging her along through the smoke and flames. They burst out into the cold air, and Abigail let go of the rope, rolling away from the horse's hooves. Her shoulder was screaming, her lungs felt like they'd been scraped raw, and when she tried to breathe, all she got was smoke and the taste of ash. Hands grabbed her, pulled her away from the barn. Nathaniel's face swam into view, his mouth moving, but she couldn't hear him over the ringing in her ears. The shooting had stopped. Morrison and his men were gone, leaving two bodies in the snow, one dead, one dying, both of them strangers whose names she'd never know. The barn was a tower of flame against the darkening sky, and there was nothing they could do but watch it burn. Again. Nathaniel helped her to her feet, and she leaned against him, her legs shaking, her shoulder a knot of agony. The horses they'd saved stood in a terrified cluster at the far end of the yard. The ones they hadn't, she didn't want to think about them. Are you hit? Nathaniel asked, his hands running over her, checking for blood. No, horse kicked me. Can you walk? I can stand. That's close enough. They stood there together, watching months of work burn for the second time. Abigail wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to find Morrison and beat him to death with her bare hands. Instead, she just stood and watched and felt something inside her calcify into something harder than bone. "This has to end," Nathaniel said. "It won't, not until one of us is dead. Then we make sure it's not us." She looked at him, this man who'd arrived at her gate with nothing and stayed through everything, and saw the same cold fury in his eyes that she felt in her chest. "You have a plan?" "The beginning of one." Inside the house, Evie was huddled by the window, Lucy crushed against her chest, tears streaming down her face. When she saw them come through the door, she ran to Nathaniel, wrapping her arms around his waist and sobbing into his coat. "It's all right," he murmured, stroking her hair. "We're all right." But they weren't all right. The barn was gone. 2 men were dead in their yard, and Hartwell's war against them had just escalated from harassment to attempted murder. Abigail sank into a chair, her shoulder throbbing, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and shock. Through the window, she could see the barn still burning, lighting up the night sky like a beacon, like a signal fire announcing their defeat. Except she wasn't defeated. Not yet. "Tell me your plan," she said to Nathaniel. He settled Evie into a chair, poured water from the kettle, and sat down across from Abigail. "We can't win this fight alone. We need allies. I told you, everyone in this valley is under Hartwell's thumb." "Not everyone. Margaret Johnson helped us. There might be others." "And how do we find them?" "Go door to door asking who's willing to stand up to the most powerful man in Montana." "Yes." She stared at him. "That's suicide." "So is staying here and waiting for Morrison to come back and finish the job." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Hartwell's been squeezing people for years, buying up land, calling in loans, running people out of the valley. We can't be the only ones who resent it. If we can find the others, unite them. They'll turn on us the second Hartwell applies pressure. Maybe, but maybe not. People will tolerate a lot when they think they're alone. But when they see someone else standing up, fighting back," he spread his hands, "it changes things." Abigail wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it wouldn't work, that people were cowards and would always choose safety over solidarity. But she remembered Margaret showing up with a wagon full of supplies. Remembered the way Silas had looked ashamed when he refused her service. Remembered a dozen small kindnesses from neighbors over the years, before Thomas died and everything went to hell. Maybe Nathaniel was right. Maybe there were others out there just waiting for someone to make the first move. Or maybe they'd all get killed trying. "All right," she said. "We try. But we do it smart. We don't go to everyone, just the people we know we can trust. People who have reason to hate Hartwell as much as we do. I'll make a list." They spent the next hour talking it through, planning, strategizing. Outside, the barn burned itself out, the flames dying to embers and then to nothing, leaving another pile of ash and charred timber to mark their failures. But inside, something else was burning, something that wouldn't be so easy to put out. By the time they went to bed, exhausted and aching, Abigail had made peace with what was coming. This was bigger than her ranch now, bigger than her pride or her grief or her stubborn refusal to quit. This was about drawing a line in the snow and daring Hartwell to cross it. She lay in the darkness, her shoulder a constant throb of pain, and thought about the men who died in her yard. She hadn't known them, didn't mourn them. They'd come to burn her out, to kill if necessary, and they'd gotten what they deserved. But their deaths changed things, made this real in a way it hadn't been before. Blood had been spilled. Hartwell wouldn't let that go unanswered. The war she'd been fighting to avoid had come anyway. Now the only question was whether she'd survive it. She must have dozed off eventually, because she woke to gray dawn light and the sound of someone knocking on the door. She grabbed the rifle from beside the bed and went to answer it, her whole body protesting the movement. Sheriff Garrett stood on the porch, his face grave, 2 deputies behind him. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm going to need you to come with me." "On what charge?" "Murder." Abigail didn't lower the rifle. "They came onto my property. They burned my barn. They shot at us first. That's not murder, Sheriff. That's self-defense." Garrett's jaw tightened. "That's for a judge to decide. Now put down the rifle and come peacefully, or I'll have to take you by force." "You're arresting the wrong person. Morrison and his men are the ones who... Pike Morrison filed a complaint this morning. Says you and Blackwood ambushed his men without provocation. Says you're unstable, dangerous. He's got 3 witnesses who'll swear to it. 3 liars, you mean. Mrs. Thornfield, I'm not going to ask again. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway behind her, already dressed, his face hard. She's not going anywhere. One of the deputies, a young man Abigail vaguely recognized from town, put his hand on his gun. Sir, I'd advise you not to interfere with the law. The law? Nathaniel's laugh was bitter. Is that what you're calling it? Garrett's face reddened. I've got a job to do, and I'm going to do it. Now, we can handle this civilized, or we can handle it the other way. But either way, Mrs. Thornfield is coming to town to answer questions about 2 dead men in her yard. Abigail felt the weight of the rifle in her hands. She could shoot Garrett, probably take down one deputy before the other got her. Then Nathaniel and Evie would be alone here, and Hartwell would have won anyway. The math didn't work. She lowered the rifle. Smart choice, Garrett said, relief flickering across his face. I want a lawyer. You'll get one. In town. And my property, you're just going to leave it unguarded? What's to stop Morrison from coming back and finishing what he started? Mr. Blackwood can look after things while you're gone. Like hell, Nathaniel stepped forward. If she goes, I go. Someone needs to make sure you don't throw her in a cell and lose the key. Garrett looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Nathaniel's face stopped him. Fine, but the girl stays here. No. Evie's voice came from inside the house, small but fierce. I'm coming too. Sweetheart, Nathaniel started. I'm not staying here alone. The girl appeared beside him, Lucy clutched in her arms, her chin set in a way that reminded Abigail painfully of herself at that age. If you leave me, I'll just follow anyway. Abigail looked at this child who'd learned too young that people didn't always come back when they left. All right, we all go. The ride to town was miserable. They crammed into the back of Garrett's wagon, Abigail, Nathaniel, and Evie, while the deputies rode alongside, hands never far from their guns. The morning was bitter cold, the sky the color of old iron, and Abigail's shoulder throbbed with every jolt of the wagon wheels. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. Town looked the same as always, the same weathered buildings, the same frozen mud streets, the same sense of a place slowly dying but too stubborn to admit it. But when they rolled down Main Street, Abigail noticed people stopping to stare. Whispers followed them like a wake. Garrett pulled the wagon up in front of a building Abigail had never had cause to visit before. The territorial courthouse, a squat structure that doubled as the sheriff's office and jail. He climbed down and gestured for Abigail to follow. Inside. The office was small and overheated, a pot-bellied stove in the corner glowing red. Behind a scarred desk sat a man Abigail didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of face that belonged on someone who counted other people's money for a living. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, standing. I'm Arthur Pemberton. I represent Mr. Cyrus Hartwell. Of course you do. Pemberton smiled, thin and humorless. Mr. Hartwell wanted me to be present for this interview, given the seriousness of the charges and his personal interest in the property in question. His personal interest in stealing my land, you mean? Now, Mrs. Thornfield, let's keep this civil. You're in enough trouble without adding slander to the list. Garrett cleared his throat. Mr. Pemberton, with respect, this is a legal proceeding. Unless you're representing the defendant, I'm here as an observer, protecting my client's interests. Your client isn't the one under arrest. Not yet. Pemberton's smile widened, though depending on what we learn today, that could change. Abigail felt rage bubbling up in her throat, hot and acidic. This was a setup, all of it. Hartwell had orchestrated the attack, then used it as grounds to have her arrested. Now his lawyer was here to make sure the screws turned tight. I want a lawyer, she said again. You're entitled to one, of course, though I should mention that the circuit judge won't be through this area for another 3 weeks. Until then, you'll be held in custody pending trial. 3 weeks in jail for defending my own property? 3 weeks to consider whether defending that property is worth your life. Pemberton pulled out a sheaf of papers. Or you could save everyone the trouble. Sign this deed of sale. Mr. Hartwell is still willing to offer fair market value, despite the complications. You walk away with money in your pocket, no charges filed, everyone goes home happy. Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You orchestrated this whole thing. The attack, the arrest, all of it, just to force her to sell. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Blackwood. I'd be careful about making statements you can't prove. I can prove Morrison's men threw a torch into our barn. I can prove they shot first. I've got witnesses. A 7-year-old child? Pemberton laughed. The court will give that testimony all the weight it deserves, which is to say none. Evie's hand tightened on Nathaniel's coat, her face going pale. Abigail felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but shifting, hardening into something new. Get out, she said quietly. Pemberton blinked. Excuse me? I said get out. This is a legal proceeding. You said so yourself. You're not my lawyer, you're not the sheriff, and you're not charging me with anything, so get the hell out of this office before I forget I'm supposed to be civilized. For a moment, Pemberton just stared at her, his expression caught between shock and anger. Then he gathered his papers with exaggerated care and stood. Very well, but you're making a mistake, Mrs. Thornfield, a costly one. He paused at the door. 3 weeks in a cell gives a person a lot of time to reconsider their choices. I suspect you'll be more amenable to reason by the time the judge arrives. He left, and the silence that followed felt like the aftermath of a thunderclap. Garrett sank into his chair, looking older than he had that morning. You didn't have to antagonize him. Yes, I did. Abigail, Mrs. Thornfield, you need to understand the position you're in. Hartwell owns half this valley. He's got lawyers, money, influence. You've got nothing. I've got the truth. The truth doesn't matter if nobody's willing to hear it. He rubbed his face with both hands. Look, I know you think I'm in Hartwell's pocket, and maybe you're right, but I'm trying to help you here. Sign the papers, take the money, start over somewhere else. No. Then you're going to die in debt and disgrace, and that ranch will go to Hartwell anyway when they auction it off to pay your legal fees. Abigail leaned forward, planting her hands on his desk. Then I guess I'll die. But I'll do it on my own land, not running scared because some rich bastard decided he wants what's mine. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. You're as stubborn as your husband was. Look where it got him. The words hit like a fist. Abigail's vision narrowed, her hands curling into fists, and for a second she wanted nothing more than to reach across that desk and... Nathaniel's hand on her arm stopped her. Don't. He's not worth it. She straightened slowly, breathing hard. You going to lock me up, Sheriff, or can I go home? I can't let you go, not with 2 dead men and witnesses claiming murder. So what then? I sit in a cell for 3 weeks while my ranch falls apart and Hartwell picks over the bones? I'll post bail $200. I don't have $200. Then I guess you're staying. Nathaniel's voice cut through the tension. I have it. Everyone turned to stare at him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth with age and handling. He opened it and poured coins onto Garrett's desk, gold and silver, clinking as they fell. 200. Count it. Garrett's eyes widened. Where did you get this kind of money? That's my business. Will it cover the bail or not? The sheriff counted the coins slowly, his expression troubled. When he finished, he nodded. It'll cover it. But Mrs. Thornfield can't leave town until the judge arrives. She'll need to check in here every day. Done. Garrett wrote out a receipt, his hand shaking slightly. Abigail watched the transaction in a daze, her mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. $200. That was more money than she'd seen in a year. Where had Nathaniel gotten it? And why hadn't he mentioned it before? When they were starving, when they were burning furniture to stay warm. They left the courthouse in silence, stepping out into a day that had gone gray and cold. Snow was starting to fall again, light flakes that melted on contact with skin. Where did that money come from? Abigail asked once they were out of earshot. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. It was for Evie, for her future. I've been saving it since her mother died, and you just spent it to bail me out. Would you rather be in a cell? I'd rather you still had money for your daughter's future. Her future depends on us winning this fight. He looked at her, his eyes hard. All our futures do. They walked back to where they'd left the wagon, but it was gone. Of course it was. Garrett had impounded it as evidence. They'd have to walk the 15 miles back to the ranch in the snow with a child, with Abigail's shoulder still throbbing from where the horse had kicked her. But before Abigail could start calculating how long that would take, a voice called out behind them. "Mrs. Thornfield!" She turned to see Margaret Johnson hurrying down the street, her coat flapping around her like wings. "Margaret? I heard what happened. Whole town's talking about it." The older woman looked furious. "Hartwell's got some nerve arresting you for defending your own property, but he made a mistake." "How do you figure?" "He pushed too hard, too fast. People are starting to notice, starting to ask questions." Margaret gestured back toward the general store. "Silas told me he saw Morrison's men loading up with torches and kerosene the day before your barn burned. He didn't say anything at the time because he was scared, but he's ready to testify now if it comes to it." Abigail felt something loosen in her chest. He'd do that? Risk Hartwell's anger? He's tired of being scared. We all are. Margaret lowered her voice. "There's others too. John Carmichael, the Hendersons, even old Pete Moss, and he hasn't taken a stand on anything since the war. They're all fed up with Hartwell buying up land and running people out. They just needed someone to make the first move. And I'm that someone? Whether you wanted to be or not." Margaret smiled, fierce and sudden. "My boys are organizing a meeting tonight at my place. Everyone who's willing to stand up to Hartwell. You should be there." "The sheriff said I can't leave town." "Then we'll move the meeting to town. The church basement, 7 o'clock. She gripped Abigail's arm. "You started something here. Don't quit now." She hurried away before Abigail could respond, disappearing into the snow that was falling heavier now. Nathaniel watched her go, then looked at Abigail. "You thinking what I'm thinking? That we might actually have a chance?" "Yeah." "Don't get ahead of yourself. Having people angry at Hartwell isn't the same as having people willing to fight him. But it's a start." It was a start. Maybe. They found rooms at the town's only boarding house, a drafty establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Chen who charged too much and asked too many questions. But she had empty rooms and was willing to let them pay on credit, so Abigail swallowed her pride and accepted. That afternoon, word spread through town about the meeting. Abigail watched from the boarding house window as people she recognized, neighbors, merchants, ranchers she'd seen at church back when she still went, moved through the streets with purpose, heading toward the small stone church at the edge of town. By 7 o'clock, the church basement was packed. Abigail counted at least 40 people, maybe more, crowding into a space meant for half that number. Margaret's 2 sons stood at the front of the room, big men with their mother's sharp eyes and their father's broad shoulders. The older one, Jacob, called for quiet, and the murmur of conversation died down. "Most of you know why we're here," he said. "Cyrus Hartwell's been buying up land in this valley for 20 years. Some of you sold to him willingly. Some sold because you didn't have a choice. And some of us are still holding on, but barely." Heads nodded around the room. "Yesterday, Hartwell's men attacked the Thornfield ranch, burned the barn, shot at Mrs. Thornfield and her workers. 2 men died, and this morning the sheriff arrested Mrs. Thornfield for murder." He paused, letting that sink in. "That's not justice. That's Hartwell using the law as a weapon to take what he wants." "What are we supposed to do about it?" someone called from the back. "Hartwell owns the bank, the store, half the businesses in town. We stand up to him, we lose everything." "We're losing everything anyway," Margaret said, standing. "Slowly, piece by piece. At least if we fight back, we go down swinging." "Fighting back gets people killed," another voice said. Abigail recognized Pete Moss, a rancher who'd been in the valley longer than anyone. "You all remember what happened to Bill Hutchins when he refused to sell. Burned out, same as Thornfield. He fought back too. Now he's dead, and his land belongs to Hartwell anyway." "So we just roll over?" Jacob's voice was sharp. "Let Hartwell take everything and say thank you for the privilege?" "I'm saying we need to be smart. Fighting Hartwell head-on is suicide." Abigail had been standing quietly at the side of the room, but now she stepped forward. The crowd parted to let her through, and she felt the weight of their eyes on her, judging, measuring, wondering if she was worth the risk. "Pete's right," she said. Fighting Hartwell head-on will get us killed. He's got money, lawyers, hired guns. We can't match him on those terms." "Then what are you suggesting?" someone asked. "We fight him where he's weak. His strength is money and fear. But money only works when people are willing to be bought. And fear only works when people are isolated, thinking they're alone." She looked around the room, meeting eyes, making sure they heard her. "We're not alone. Not anymore. There's 40 of us in this room, and probably twice that many who'd join if they knew we were organizing. That's a lot of people, a lot of witnesses, a lot of voices all saying the same thing, that Hartwell's a thief and we're not going to take it anymore." "Words don't stop bullets," Pete said. "No, but they do sway judges, they sway juries, they sway public opinion." She pointed toward the stairs. "Up there in the church office, there's a telegraph. We can wire the territorial governor, the federal land office, newspapers in Denver and Cheyenne. Tell them what's happening here. Make enough noise that Hartwell can't just sweep it under the rug." Margaret nodded slowly. "Public pressure. Shame him into backing down. Or at least make him think twice before burning down another barn." "That still doesn't solve the immediate problem," John Carmichael said. He was a solid man, weathered and practical. "You've got a trial coming up in 3 weeks. Hartwell's lawyer will have his witnesses all lined up, all telling the same story. How do you fight that?" "With the truth. And with witnesses of our own." Abigail looked at the crowd. "Silas saw Morrison's men buying supplies for arson. Who else saw something? Who else knows something that could prove Hartwell's behind this?" Silence. Then, slowly, a hand went up. A woman Abigail didn't know, thin and nervous looking. I work at the bank. I saw the paperwork. Hartwell had your tax payment redirected to a different account. Made it look like you never paid." Another voice. "I was in the saloon 2 weeks ago. Heard Morrison bragging about how he was going to run you off the land one way or another." And another. "My son works for Hartwell. He quit last month after Hartwell told him to sabotage the fence lines on the Henderson property." The testimonies kept coming, piece by piece, people stepping forward with fragments of evidence that alone meant nothing but together painted a picture of systematic harassment and corruption. Abigail felt hope stirring in her chest, fragile but real. "This is good," Nathaniel said quietly beside her. "This is really good." But Abigail knew better than to celebrate too soon. Hartwell hadn't gotten where he was by being stupid or giving up easily. He'd respond to this. The only question was how. The answer came 3 days later. Abigail was in the boarding house when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of something heavy being dragged. She went to the window and felt her stomach drop. Nathaniel was in the street, held between 2 of Garrett's deputies, his face bloody, his hands bound behind his back. She ran downstairs and out into the cold, Evie close behind her. "What the hell is this?" Garrett stood nearby, looking uncomfortable. "New evidence came to light. Turns out Mr. Blackwood is wanted for murder in Texas. Killed a man during a card game 5 years ago." "That's a lie." "There's a warrant. It's legal and binding." Nathaniel met her eyes, and she saw resignation there. "It's true. I killed a man, but he drew on me first. It was self-defense." "Texas law doesn't see it that way," Garrett said. "They want him extradited. I'm holding him until the marshal arrives." Abigail's mind raced. This was Hartwell's doing. Had to be. He'd dug into Nathaniel's past, found something he could use, and now he was using it to take away her strongest ally. "How convenient," she said, "that this warrant shows up right when we're building a case against Hartwell. The law's the law, Mrs. Thornfield. The law's whatever Hartwell pays you to make it." Garrett's face reddened. "That's enough. Take him inside." The deputies started to drag Nathaniel toward the courthouse, and Evie ran after them, crying, "Papa! Papa! No!" Nathaniel looked back at her, anguish clear on his face. "It's all right, sweetheart. Abigail will take care of you." "But Papa, I'll be fine. Just be brave. Be strong." They pulled him inside, and the door slammed shut. Evie stood in the street, snow falling around her, Lucy clutched in her arms, sobbing like her heart was breaking. Abigail gathered the girl into her arms, holding her while she cried, feeling rage and helplessness war in her chest. Hartwell was dismantling everything. Systematically, ruthlessly, one piece at a time.
First the barn, then the arrest. Now Nathaniel. She looked up at the courthouse, at the windows where she knew Hartwell's lawyer was probably watching, enjoying this. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Abigail wasn't sure they could win. That night, Abigail sat in the cramped boarding house room with Evie curled against her side, the girl's breathing finally evening out after hours of crying. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Chen moving around downstairs, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of wind rattling windows. The world kept turning, indifferent to their suffering. She stared at the ceiling, her mind working through the pieces of this nightmare. Hartwell had her boxed in from every angle. She was stuck in town, unable to work the ranch. Nathaniel was locked up, facing extradition for a killing that might have been self-defense, but would never be judged that way. The neighbors who'd stood up at the meeting were probably reconsidering right now, wondering if solidarity was worth dying for. And in 3 weeks, a judge would arrive who was almost certainly in Hartwell's pocket, and this whole thing would end with her land seized and sold at auction to pay legal debts she couldn't afford. The math didn't work. It hadn't worked from the beginning, but Abigail had never been good at accepting what the math said. She eased herself out of bed, careful not to wake Evie, and pulled on her coat. Downstairs, Mrs. Chen looked up from the book she was reading by lamplight. Going out? Just need air. It's past 10. Nothing good happens in town this late. I'll be careful. She stepped out into the cold, her breath fogging in the air. The street was empty, most businesses dark, just a few lit windows marking where people were still awake. The saloon at the far end of town glowed yellow and warm, voices and piano music spilling out into the night. Abigail walked in the other direction, toward the church. She didn't know what she was looking for. Answers, maybe? Or just space to think without Evie's grief pressing against her. The church door was unlocked, as it always was, and she slipped inside. The sanctuary was dark, except for moonlight filtering through the high windows. She sat in a back pew, letting the silence settle around her. She'd stopped coming here after Thomas died, stopped believing that prayers changed anything, or that suffering had purpose. But the building still held a kind of peace, even if she didn't believe in what it stood for anymore. Figured I'd find you here. Abigail turned to see Margaret Johnson standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the streetlight. You following me? Saw you leave the boarding house. Thought you might need company. Margaret came down the aisle and settled into the pew beside her, grunting with the effort. My knees hate the cold. Getting old is hell. Better than the alternative. Is it? Margaret looked at her sidelong. Sometimes I'm not so sure. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Margaret said, Heard about Blackwood. That's rough. Hartwell's getting desperate. Going after Nathaniel means he knows we're getting close to something he doesn't want exposed. Or it means he's got us beat, and he's just twisting the knife. You losing faith already? I never had faith. I've got anger, which is more useful. Margaret shifted, the pew creaking under her weight. But anger only takes you so far. At some point, you need a plan. I'm working on it. Work faster. People are getting scared. The Henderson boy got beat up behind the saloon tonight. 3 men in masks told him to keep his mouth shut if he knows what's good for him. His father's talking about leaving town. Abigail's hands curled into fists. Hartwell's sending a message. And it's working. You need to send one back. Something bigger than words. Like what? I'm stuck in town, Nathaniel's locked up, and we've got no money for lawyers or bribes or anything else that might actually help. So we do what people without money always do. We make noise, lots of it. Abigail looked at the older woman. You've got an idea. Maybe? You said we should wire the newspapers, the governor, the land office. We did that. Sent telegrams 2 days ago, but telegrams are easy to ignore. What we need is someone to come here, see what's happening, and tell the story loud enough that Hartwell can't bury it. And how do we make that happen? Margaret smiled, sharp and dangerous. My nephew works for the Denver Post. Been trying to make a name for himself as an investigative reporter. I sent him a telegram yesterday. Told him there's a story here about land theft, corruption, and a woman fighting back against impossible odds. He wired back this morning. He's coming. When? Tomorrow, if the train's on time. He'll be here before the trial starts. Abigail felt something shift in her chest, not hope exactly, but possibility. Hartwell will try to shut him down. Let him try. Jacob's a stubborn bastard, takes after his aunt. Once he smells a story, he doesn't let go. Margaret stood, her knees popping. You just need to hold on a little longer. Keep people organized. Keep them talking. Don't let Hartwell isolate us again. That's easier said than done when his men are beating people in alleys. Then we make sure nobody walks alone. We watch each other's backs. We show Hartwell that fear only works when people are scattered. Together, we're harder to break. After Margaret left, Abigail sat in the dark church a while longer, turning the pieces over in her mind. A reporter could change things. Public scrutiny, pressure from outside the valley, questions asked by people Hartwell couldn't buy or intimidate. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. She walked back to the boarding house through streets that felt less empty now, more watched. Twice she saw movement in the shadows, heard footsteps that might have been following her, but nobody approached, and she made it back without incident. Upstairs, Evie was still asleep. Lucy clutched against her chest. Abigail stood in the doorway watching this child who'd lost so much and might lose more before this was over. The girl deserved better than this, deserved safety, stability, a future that didn't involve violence and fear. But the world didn't give people what they deserved. It gave them what they could take and hold on to. Abigail would have to hold on harder. The next day brought the reporter. Jacob Chen arrived on the noon train, a young man in his late 20s with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He found Abigail at the courthouse, where she was checking in with Garrett per the terms of her bail. Mrs. Thornfield? Jacob Chen, Denver Post. He offered his hand. My aunt tells me you're at the center of something worth writing about. Your aunt talks too much. Family trait. He pulled out a notebook. Mind if I ask you some questions? They walked while they talked, Abigail telling the story from the beginning, Thomas's death, the offers from Hartwell, the burned barns, the threats, the manufactured arrest. Jacob wrote it all down in shorthand, occasionally asking for clarification or details. And you've got witnesses who'll testify to Hartwell's harassment? If they haven't been scared off by now. Let me talk to them. Sometimes people are braver when they know someone's listening who can't be bought. He spent the rest of the day interviewing anyone who'd talk to him. Margaret, Silas at the general store, the woman from the bank, the man who'd heard Morrison bragging in the saloon. He asked hard questions, took careful notes, and by evening he had pages filled with testimony. That night, he wired his editor. The next morning, the story hit the Denver papers. Abigail didn't see it until 2 days later when someone brought a copy to town on the supply wagon. The headline read, Widow Fights Land Baron in Montana Valley, Allegations of Arson, Corruption, and Murder in Territorial Land Grab. The article laid it all out. Hartwell's systematic acquisition of land through intimidation and fraud, the suspicious fires, the arrests on trumped-up charges. Jacob had interviewed a dozen people and woven their testimonies into a narrative that made Hartwell look like exactly what he was, a thief using money and violence to steal from people who couldn't fight back. The reaction was immediate. By noon, 3 more reporters had arrived in town, smelling blood in the water. By evening, the territorial governor's office had sent a telegraph demanding an investigation. And by the next morning, a federal marshal showed up asking questions that Sheriff Garrett couldn't dodge or deflect. Hartwell responded the way cornered animals always did, with violence. Abigail was walking back from the general store with Evie when Morrison stepped out of an alley, blocking their path. He looked different than before, rougher, meaner, with the desperate edge of a man who knew his world was collapsing. You think you're clever, he said, getting reporters involved, making noise. But all you've done is make things worse. Abigail pushed Evie behind her. Get out of my way, Morrison. Hartwell's finished with playing nice. He wanted to buy you out, give you a chance to walk away, but you couldn't leave it alone. He stepped closer. So now we do this the hard way. You threatening me in broad daylight, with federal marshals in town? I'm telling you how it is. Tonight, something's going to happen, something bad. And when it's over, nobody's going to care about your ranch anymore because you won't be around to care about it either. Abigail's hand went to the knife at her belt, but before she could draw it, a voice called out behind Morrison, Step away from her. Nathaniel stood at the end of the alley,
flanked by two of the federal marshals. He looked rough, bruised and exhausted, his hands still showing marks from the ropes. But he was out of jail and he was armed. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped when he saw the marshals. His face went red, then pale. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah," Nathaniel said quietly. "It is." Morrison backed away, his eyes promising future violence, then disappeared down the street. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "How are you out?" she asked Nathaniel. The marshals looked into the Texas warrant, found some irregularities. Turns out the signature on the extradition request was forged. Someone paid a lot of money to make it look legitimate, but not enough to make it stand up to federal scrutiny. He smiled, tired but genuine. "Hartwell's getting sloppy." One of the marshals, a lean man with gray in his beard, stepped forward. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm Marshal William Grant. We need to talk about what's been happening in this valley." They talked for hours. Abigail told Grant everything, backed up by Nathaniel's testimony and the stack of witness statements Jacob had collected. The marshal listened, took notes, and asked questions that suggested he actually cared about the answers. "This is bigger than one woman's ranch," he said finally. "If half of what you're telling me is true, Hartwell's been violating federal land statutes, territorial fraud laws, and basic criminal codes for years. The governor's office has authorized a full investigation." "How long will that take?" "Weeks, maybe months. But in the meantime, I can provide protection. Make sure nobody burns any more barns or beats up any more witnesses. Hartwell's got resources. He'll find a way around you." "Maybe, but he's running out of room to maneuver. The newspapers are watching now. The governor's watching. He makes another move like burning your barn, and it's not just you he has to deal with. It's the federal government." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more protection than Abigail had ever had before. That evening, Margaret organized another meeting at the church. This time, even more people showed up, packed so tight some had to stand in the aisles. The mood was different than before, less scared, more determined. The newspaper article had changed something, made people realize they weren't alone in this fight. Jacob stood at the front of the room, reading from a telegram he'd just received. "The territorial legislature is introducing a bill to reform land transfer laws, make it harder for men like Hartwell to manipulate the system. They're calling it the Thornfield Act." Applause broke out, and Abigail felt her face go hot. She hadn't fought this battle to get laws named after her. She'd fought it because she was too stubborn to quit. But if it meant other people wouldn't have to go through what she'd gone through, she'd take it. The trial came 2 weeks later. The judge who arrived was not the corrupt puppet Hartwell had been counting on, but a stern woman from the territorial capital named Judge Sarah Mitchell, who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from either side. The courtroom was packed. Half the valley showed up, along with the reporters and federal marshals. Hartwell sat in the front row with Pemberton, his face carefully neutral, but Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders. The prosecution presented their case: 2 dead men, witnesses who claimed Abigail had fired without provocation, evidence of a long-standing dispute over land. It sounded bad when laid out like that, clinical and damning. Then the defense had their turn. Nathaniel testified about Morrison's men attacking first, about the torches thrown, about defending their lives and property. Silas testified about selling kerosene and torches to Morrison's men the day before the fire. The woman from the bank testified about the redirected tax payments. A dozen other witnesses came forward, each adding another piece to the picture of systematic harassment and fraud. And then Abigail took the stand. The prosecutor tried to paint her as unstable, violent, a woman who'd snapped under pressure and murdered 2 men in cold blood. But Judge Mitchell shut him down every time he veered into speculation or character assassination. "Stick to facts, counselor. Save the storytelling for the saloon." Abigail told her story simply, without embellishment or drama. What had happened, what she'd done, why she'd done it. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Mitchell leaned back in her chair, studying Abigail with sharp eyes. "Mrs. Thornfield, do you regret killing those men?" "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret defending my land and my people." "Would you do it again, if faced with the same situation?" "Yes." The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you. You may step down. The deliberation took less than an hour. When the jury returned, their verdict was unanimous, not guilty on grounds of self-defense. The courtroom erupted in cheers. People Abigail barely knew were congratulating her, shaking her hand, slapping her on the back. But she couldn't celebrate yet. The murder charge was dropped, but Hartwell still wanted her land. That fight wasn't over. Except it turned out, it was. 3 days after the trial, Marshal Grant arrested Cyrus Hartwell on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and intimidation. Pemberton tried to negotiate, but the evidence was overwhelming. Years of falsified documents, forged signatures, bribes paid to officials who were now cooperating to save their own skins. Hartwell's empire collapsed in a matter of weeks. The land he'd acquired through fraud was returned to its rightful owners or put up for legitimate sale. The bank foreclosed on his holdings. The businesses he owned were sold at auction. Morrison disappeared before he could be arrested. Some said he fled to California. Others said he ended up face down in a ditch outside of town. Either way, he was gone. By the time spring arrived, the valley looked different. Not physically, the land was still the same rolling hills and stubborn grass, but the feeling had changed. People looked each other in the eye again, helped neighbors without being asked, stopped walking around scared all the time. Abigail stood on her porch and looked out at the ranch she'd fought so hard to keep. The barn they'd rebuilt after the second fire was bigger than before, sturdier, with a proper foundation and a roof that didn't leak. The cattle had survived the winter, leaner than she'd like, but alive. The horses were fat and lazy in their stalls. Nathaniel came out to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cold morning air. He handed her one. "Spring looks good on you," he said. "Spring looks good on everything after a winter like that." "That's truth." He sipped his coffee, looking out at the greening hills. "Been meaning to talk to you about something." "Oh?" He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. Nathaniel faced down armed men without flinching, but asking simple questions seemed to tie him in knots. "Evie and we've been here almost a year now, and I've been thinking, this place feels like home, more than anywhere else ever has." "It is your home, long as you want it to be." "That's not quite what I meant." He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "What I'm trying to say, badly, is that I'd like it to be official. The home part, the family part, all of it." Abigail's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Nathaniel, I'm not Thomas. I know that. I'm not trying to replace him or make you forget him. But what we've built here, you and me and Evie, it's worth keeping, worth making permanent." He pulled something from his pocket, a ring, simple silver, worn smooth. "This was my mother's. Only thing I have left of her. I know it's not much, but yes." He stopped mid-sentence. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you, if you're done stumbling over your words." A smile spread across his face, genuine and startled and happy in a way she'd never seen before. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. "Well," he said, "that went better than I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, for you to laugh me out of Montana." She looked at this man who'd shown up at her gate with nothing but a daughter in desperation, who'd stayed through fire and starvation and war, who'd stood beside her when everyone else ran. He wasn't perfect, neither was she, but they'd survived together, and that counted for more than perfection ever could. "I don't laugh that easy," she said, and kissed him. The wedding was small, held in the same church where they'd organized the resistance against Hartwell. Margaret stood up with Abigail. Jacob and his brother stood with Nathaniel. Evie was flower girl, beaming so wide it looked like her face might split, Lucy tucked carefully in the crook of her arm. Half the valley showed up for the reception afterward, bringing food and music and the kind of rough celebration that came from people who'd fought together and won. Abigail danced with Nathaniel, with Margaret's sons, with old Pete Moss, who'd finally decided she was worth supporting once it looked like she might actually win. Late in the evening, as the party was winding down, Evie tugged on Abigail's sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Does this mean you're my mama now?" Abigail knelt down so they were eye to eye. This child who'd lost so much, who'd been so careful with her trust, who'd chosen to stay when running would have been easier. "Do you want me to be?" Evie nodded. suddenly shy. Then yes, I'm your mama now. If you'll have me, I'll have you. They held each other there on the church steps while the party went on inside, and Abigail felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Complete. Not because the fighting was over, or the land was safe, or the future was certain, but because she'd built something new from the wreckage of the old. A family, a home, a life worth living. Summer came, and with it the work of ranching, calves to brand, fences to mend, hay to cut and stack for the next winter. Abigail worked alongside Nathaniel, her body remembering the rhythm of it, growing strong again as the weight she'd lost in winter slowly came back. She'd never be small, would always take up space in a way that made some people uncomfortable, but she'd stopped apologizing for it, stopped trying to shrink herself to fit other people's expectations. Evie grew too, taller and stronger, learning to ride and rope and handle cattle like she'd been born to it. The careful, frightened child who'd arrived clutching a doll had become something else. Still quiet, still thoughtful, but with a core of steel that reminded Abigail of herself. In August, Margaret came by with news. Legislature passed the land reform bill. Governor signed it this morning. It's official. The Thornfield Act? That's what they're calling it. Your fight changed things, Abigail. Made it harder for men like Hartwell to steal from people who can't fight back. Abigail didn't know what to say to that. She'd never set out to change laws or make history. She'd just been too stubborn to quit. I didn't do it alone, she said finally. Wouldn't have made it without you. Without all of you. No, you wouldn't have. But you're the one who stood first. The one who showed the rest of us it was possible to stand at all. Margaret gripped her shoulder. That matters. After Margaret left, Abigail walked up the hill behind the house to where Thomas was buried. She hadn't been up here in months, too busy surviving to make time for the dead. The stone was weathered now, the carved letters starting to blur with wind and rain, but it was still there, still marking the place where he rested. I kept it, she told him. The land, the ranch, everything you built. I kept it. The wind blew across the grass, carrying the smell of summer and growing things. And I found something else, someone else. I think you'd like him. He's stubborn, like you, works hard, loves Evie like she's his own. She paused. I hope you don't mind, that I moved on, that I found a way to be happy again. The grass whispered, and somewhere a hawk cried, riding the thermals high above the valley. Abigail stood there a while longer, then walked back down the hill to the house where Nathaniel and Evie were waiting, to the life she'd fought so hard to build and hold. The ranch grew over the years. They added acreage, bought cattle, built a proper barn that didn't lean or leak. Evie grew up and married a boy from the next valley over, gave them grandchildren who ran shrieking through the house, and played in the fields where Abigail had once fought for her survival. People in town stopped whispering about the widow who was too big, too stubborn, too much. Started saying instead that she was the woman who'd stood up to Hartwell, who'd changed the laws, who'd shown everyone that strength wasn't about size or gender or following the rules. It was about refusing to break when the world tried its damnedest to break you. And when Abigail finally died, years later, old and tired and ready, they buried her on that hill next to Thomas with a stone that read, "She stood when others fell." It wasn't poetic, wasn't fancy, but it was true. And in the end, truth was all that mattered. The ranch continued after her, passed down through generations who knew the stories but couldn't quite believe them. How their grandmother had fought a land baron and won. How she'd survived winter and starvation and fire. How she'd built a family from strangers and a life from ruins. The stories got bigger over time, embellished and exaggerated, until they barely resembled what had actually happened. But the core remained true. A woman alone had refused to quit, had gathered people around her, had fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. And she'd won. Not because she was special or chosen or destined for greatness, but because she was too stubborn to accept defeat and too strong to break, no matter how hard the world pushed. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be small, trying not to take up space, trying to fit into boxes that were never meant to hold them. Abigail had spent hers learning that the only box that mattered was the one you built yourself, and that you could make it as big as you needed, as strong as you wanted, as unbreakable as you chose to be. The wind still blew across the Montana plains, harsh and constant and unforgiving. But the ranch stood against it, solid and enduring, proof that some things couldn't be broken, no matter how hard the world tried. And on clear nights, if you stood on the porch and listened close, you could almost hear the echo of Abigail's voice on that wind, still fierce after all these years. I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere.